Okay, let's begin. Thank you very much to all of you for making the time today. For those who don't know me, my name is Ju Xiong. I'm the director of the Electoral Regulation Research Network. A few weeks ago, when Tim sent me an email saying that he was making some last-minute journey to New Zealand, and he said, would I be happy to have him speak at our law school? I was absolutely chuffed because I think Tim is really one of the most interesting scholars to really emerge in the area of electoral law in recent times. And I think his book, and if you don't have a copy, go grab one, Capitalism versus Democracy, I think is a huge contribution in terms of our understanding of electoral law, and particularly really a sort of scorching critique of how electoral law, particularly campaign finance, has really sort of developed in the United States. Today, Tim is going to talk about Donald Trump, but really more broadly, his mode of government, and how can we seek to understand his mode of government, if you like, beyond the antics and beyond the outrage. And this article, this presentation is based on an article that is in a special edition, so this is a bit of self-promotion here, of the King's Law Journal that Tim, myself, and Keith Ewing co-edited, which is on electoral law. And it's entitled American Kleptocracy. So please join me in welcoming.
Thanks, Ju Xiong. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. Thanks for coming. Exactly as Professor Tim said, what this piece is doing is to look beneath the chaos. Trump is such a distracting, fearful, worrisome, extreme, unpredictable figure that I think he does a pretty good job in distracting us from the real game in town, the real question, which is what's the underlying logic? What's the system of government? Because there always is. I mean, fascism can be very chaotic, but it's still a system of government, right? So what's the underlying system of government, the government beneath Trump and his administration, his advisors, and so on? And this article is an effort to cut through all of the chaos and arrive at a structural understanding of what's happening right now in the United States to democracy. By the way, I don't really believe there's a democracy there to begin with, and that's a bit where we're going to start the talk. What I want to do is take you all through what you might call the material conditions that were there at the outset, right before Trump. So those are the material precursors, okay? The next thing I want to do is talk about the ideology or the philosophy, let's call it the ideological precursors that were there before Trump. And then we'll start to get to what Trump is actually doing, first why he was elected, and then what he's doing now that he's in power. So we'll talk a bit about material conditions, the philosophy that those are pointing to, how he won office, and what he's doing with it. The title of the article gives a lot away. This really is an attempt to articulate kleptocracy as a mode of government. So in terms of material precursors, what was happening before Trump was plutocracy, okay, which is different from kleptocracy. The standard definition of plutocracy is government by or for the wealthy. It can be because the wealthy are governing, but they have a bunch of interest groups beneath them, right, that they're working with. More often, plutocracy refers to government for the wealthy. So you have politicians who are genuine politicians who have been in politics for a while, and they're sort of administrating the state in the interests of interest groups, right, and the wealthy below them. The data on that are really clear. The data on a pre-existing plutocracy are very clear data. You can start with Thomas Piketty, for example, who demonstrated, the English version was published in 2014 of Capital in the 21st Century. He demonstrates that out of total wealth in the United States, the top 10% of wealth holders own 70% of total wealth. That number has since gone up to a quarter, or 3/4, I'm sorry. It's now 75% since he published that. So that's, then if you look at the lower portion of the United States socioeconomically, what percentage of total wealth do you imagine that the bottom 50% of Americans owns? It's actually only 2% of national wealth that the bottom 50% of the entire United States owns. That's returns on capital and labor combined. Now, those levels are actually pretty high historically. Throughout world history, they've led to violent revolution. throughout U.S. history, they're typical of slavery and the Industrial Revolution, the Gilded Age and slavery, which I also think is very attention-grabbing, that the United States has essentially kind of gone into this, what I call the third coming of American plutocracy. There was a slave plutocracy. Okay, slavery wasn't just an economic system, it was a political system, and it remained in effect so long up to the Civil War because it had its hands in government. And the Gilded Age was up. People always think, oh, that's just a moment of sort of cruel capitalism and sweatshops and so on. Yeah, but why did that last so long? Obviously, the robber barons and the hands that they had in government. So Piketty speaks to sort of the third coming of American plutocracy along the lines of radical wealth concentration. Besides, I have a photo of these folks. So there's Piketty on the left. On the right are Gillens and Page, who are two of the latest political scientists to come to the same conclusion that political scientists have been reaching for a long time now, which is that government in the United States is entirely unaccountable to everybody except organized interest groups and the wealthy. You can look at Theda Skocpol's work at Harvard, you can look at Larry Bartell's work at Princeton, or you can look at these two at Princeton and Northwestern. And they have big data sets. They're working with 2,000 issue areas, actually. And they find that, in their words, there's no independent influence over policy exercised by poor or middle class Americans. Pretty categorical conclusions coming from these political scientists who are not Marxists, by the way. I mean, this is a very surreal moment in US history where you have all these guys in suits and ties working at Ivy League universities, driving BMWs and Mercedes, and saying what the most radical protesters have been saying throughout recent history. It's really, we needed the statistical models to figure that out. But now you have them. Okay, so that's extreme economic inequality and extreme political inequality. And obviously those dovetail. One of Piketty's points looking at democracies across the world is that today's levels of inequality are not normal or natural. They're manufactured. They're the product of law and policy. Okay? But if we're looking at democracies, why would there be laws and policies in effect that concentrate wealth in this upper echelon of the 1%? Why? That's counterintuitive to think that a representative government would produce policies that harken back to the Gilded Age. So Gillens and Page are really helpful because they say, yeah, of course that's counterintuitive if you assume representation. But actually there is no representation for middle class and poor Americans. Great. Now, so then the next question, now that we've figured out why is wealth concentrated so much, well, political inequality, well, what explains political inequality, right? So there's a lot of explanations for that. Education is one of them, people not paying attention and not caring or not voting, zoning, voting rights restrictions. But amidst this constellation of reasons why most people have no political power, a big one is political finance. The financing of campaigns, parties, outside expenditure organizations that control or influence the political debate, the prioritization of issues, the saliency of issues. Besides, in addition to that, lobbyists, right, and the balance of funding there. So when you come to political finance, I think you're coming to a deeper causal level for these other two things, political inequality and economic inequality. I think political finance is one of those deeply causal explanations for that. And we know a lot about political finance now, empirically, that we didn't know before. To give you a few examples, everybody knows across the world how expensive US elections are. Everybody knows it costs about $1 billion to become president, about $10 million to win a Senate seat, about $1 million to become a member of the House of Representatives. Fine, but it's a big country, and media markets are large and expensive, right? So what's the big deal? Well, we know fairly empirically from interviews that office holders, sitting office holders, as well as new candidates spend about 50 to 75% of their time raising money. So raising money becomes your principal activity, essentially. Not civic rallies, not studying the issues, but studying the issues from the perspective of, is this profitable to have this political platform? Who can I appeal to? Who can fund me? Because everybody knows campaign finance in the United States is essentially privatized. The Federal Election Campaign Act did, of course, contain a limited public funding mechanism for presidential candidates, but that's it. And lately, presidential candidates have been declining that because the constraints aren't worth it. So we have a privatized regime, so they spend most of their time raising money. That still doesn't explain why politics would be so unrepresentative. It depends on who the campaign donors and spenders are, right? Because if you have to appeal to campaign donors and spenders, and that's what you spend most of your time doing, fashioning your policies and your platform and so on around that, well, if those donors and spenders were representative of the overall population in some way, it wouldn't matter. You could almost thank them, right? Because when you do survey people across the world, they don't want to have higher taxes to fund all these corrupt politicians and parties who they're tired of, right? So you could say, Americans ought to be thanking the Koch brothers and Sheldon Adelson and all these wealthy Americans for funding elections, so the rest of us don't have to, right? If they were representative. But we also know that they're not. Let me just start numerically. So what percentage of the general population do these donors and spenders represent? Well, from 1990 to 2016, the average number for the population of these donors and spenders, they are 0.36% of the US population, the group of donors who provide most of the money. So they're less than 0.5% of Americans who are funding or providing the great majority of funds for campaigns. The Occupy movement became famous for that 1% slogan, right? The 1% versus the 99% and so on. Well, that's not even close. People thought that was an exaggeration. When it comes to campaign finance, that's charitable. If only the 1% controlled campaign finance, that would be a much more democratic world to live in. It's 0.36%. Okay, so we also know that outside spending is influential. Office holders running for re-election and candidates their first time around can quite easily get defeated by last-minute ad campaigns to the tune of millions of dollars that are launched in the final days of an election. You have a really close election, be careful not to piss off the super PACs. Okay, a lobbyist can walk into your office and say, depending on where you come out on this, we're going to launch a $20 million ad campaign against you. Right? You don't even have the money. And in fact, the major campaign finance reformers, co-sponsors of the Disclose Act, for example, in 2014, lost their re-election bids amidst an unprecedented barrage of outside spending. Begich, Hagan, Kay, I'm blanking on. I should actually read their names. It's sort of like reading the names of the dead at a funeral. You don't actually want to fail to name these people. Mark Udall, Kay Hagan, Bruce Bagley, Mark Begich, who lost their re-election bids amidst $13 to $24 million in outside spending against each of them. And the Brennan Center reported, wow, the winners of the 11 most competitive races in 2014, the same year all these folks lost, the winners had more than $131 million in dark money behind them. These 501c4s that don't have to report their donors, ostensibly charitable or organizations devoted to public activities. So the outside spending matters. Who provides it? If we said it's the 0.36% for donors, what is it for spenders? Here is where Occupy Wall Street's 1% is a joke, because 80% of the super PAC money, for example, in 2012 and 2016 came from 0.0000084% of the population, adult population of the United States. I'm not even counting the kids who aren't giving their allowance to the super PACs. Okay, this is a minuscule portion of Americans. And by the way, the donors matter a great deal too. If you watch the U.S. presidential primaries closely this time around, you might have seen the 5 choice Republican candidates auditioning for the Koch brothers money. The Koch brothers held these auditions early on in the Republican primary, and it was the Koch brothers and a few hundred of their allies determining how to spend the $889 million they pledged to donate that cycle around. Although some of it could have been expenditure too, but You can't coordinate with that. So we are talking largely about donations. There's another good donation statistic as well that I'm blanking on that I do want to give you. Right. In terms of the seed money for the presidential campaigns, that's what this picture is about. 158 families provided nearly half of the money to the campaigns early on. It's sort of a parallel to the Koch brothers event. This is a New York Times graphic where they show sort of what those 158 houses would look like on top of the mass of everyone else's house or apartment. So the donations and expenditures matter, and they're funded by this tiny little group. Great. So again, though, we said if that tiny little group were representative, we know they're a tiny, tiny, tiny slice, but what if they were representative? Okay, we know they're not. They are the donor-spender class, 99% white, 70% 50 or older, 70% male, and 85% earning more than $100,000 a year. So highly unrepresentative group, racially, gender-wise, age, income. Here's, though, where the rubber meets the road. Even if it was a bunch of middle-aged or older white men who made good money and were fairly well educated, they could still have representative political opinions or preferences, couldn't they? But they don't. And that's their defining element. Because you can take all of these older, well-educated males who are white, and even among that cohort, their political views are way to the left of the donor-spender class. Okay, the donor-spender class distinguishes itself in their significantly more conservative stance on economic issues. Social programs, entitlements, taxation, affirmative action. Now we come full circle back to Piketty. This is where political finance really does seem to have great explanatory power, because remember, Piketty says you can't get this kind of inequality without laws and policies that concentrate wealth. Well, what are those laws and policies? Precisely the ones that the donor-spender class wants. That's what those laws and policies are. Privatization of public resources, privatization of additional industries, a tax code that would benefit Trump and his constituents, tort law reform, kill affirmative action, kill Obamacare, kill subsidies, kill entitlements, kill public education, etc. Right? It's profitable in the short term, at least. Okay. So, and there's a very similar story to be told for lobbying. I don't want to go too far over on time, so I'm going to skip it. So, those are our material precursors for kleptocracy. Okay, this is where things stood prior to Trump winning the election. Now, on the ideological side, so we have this vision now of the United States as a privatized market for political power, right? This privatized political market. Well, what does that say? What does that say about where democracy has ended up, right? Is that coherent with the overall story of self-governance? So think back to Francis Fukuyama and the other triumphant sorts of folks who are saying, hey, democracy won. This is going to be great. Ideological conflict is over. The world is now going to be a just place now that the Berlin Wall has fallen. And there were some initial indicators that really seemed to support that narrative, right? At the time the Berlin Wall fell, only 1/3 of states were holding elections that could be considered relatively free and so on. By 1999, it was 2/3 of states, I mean, the world's nations, right? So most countries become democratic, but just a couple years later, the narrative of an end to history starts to get challenged. And that's when a bunch of comparative law scholars, as well as the United States Agency for International Development, reach this really troubling conclusion. And they say, wow, now we have a lot of democracies, but guess what, folks? Systemic corruption is endemic. One of the quotes is that payback of campaign debts generates a form of corruption commonly found around the world. And the U.S. aid agency as well as a bunch of comparative law scholars sort of go surveying the world's democracies, and they reach very similar conclusions about the lack of transparency, undue influence, not just bribery, but bribery too. So this complicates things, because this narrative about the end of history was a narrative about the end of domination. It was a narrative about the end of tyranny, right? Why was democracy so incredible, right? Well, for the longest time, political power looked like this. Religious authority dominated the state and the people, and there was no real self-governance there. There was no political participation. There was no community of political equals defining their own destiny, right? Without some power center telling them what to do. And for the longest time, political power looked like this. Family, nobility, and conquest, right? The old monarchical model. Again, there's really no self-governance there unless you were a duke or a baron or something at the minimum. And again, the triumph of democracy said this sort of tyrannical model is over. The same thing for dictatorships, this heavy, heavy power center controlling everything else. And they argued the same thing for communism, where a hegemonic single party controlled the people, the state, the economy, and so on, right? So democracy was this model where there was no domination anywhere. It was the people freely deciding their own destiny in a community of equals. And that was a beautiful thing. I think it would be a beautiful thing if it were true. But what it starts to look like, I think if we're honest about the data, as well as perhaps our own life experiences and things you don't need the data to tell you necessarily, is that there's a new power center now that has a tremendous degree of influence on everything else, all the other institutions and systems in society. Now that's a troubling place to end up, right? That's not consistent with the narrative. What it is consistent with is privatization, which you could argue is the real system in place. So a fundamental question, this political scientist, right, C.V. McPherson or Lindblom in the 1970s, were talking about sort of the main question about where the world was going was one of, to what extent does the market replace the state, or to what extent does the state replace the market? Where's the power center? How are systems being governed in accordance with financial interests and transactions and marketplace values and systems, or in accordance with some kind of political community under conditions of freedom, equality, and self-governance for all, right? So you can see that this is the uncontroversial list. Well, healthcare is kind of controversial, but a lot of these things are becoming, in the United States at least, settled areas under market control. You can then progress, this is where the private sphere is growing, nobody doubts it. You can then progress to markets that, areas of society that we don't still yet think of as properly subject to market control, right? War, the privatization of war is a, I hope, controversial idea to everybody. The industries that profit from war, the mercenaries who are privately hired, private armies, all that sort of thing. Prisons in the United States, the prison industry, right? The prison industry is booming. Private jails. It works really well for penal policies that have longer and longer sentences. It also works really well for Trump's immigration plans. Sex with prostitution, drugs, body parts, organs, endangered species, weapons of mass destruction. This is more the controversial list, right? And this is where I would think that we would put elections and political parties, where it's problematic to privatize that. These are public goods, or they're dangerous things, or they're things that just shouldn't be subject to market control. Okay, so the implication then for the end of history idea is we have the globalization of democracy, and people hoped corruption was temporary. We looked as democracies were expanding across the world. People said, yeah, okay, they're not that transparent yet. They're a bit corrupt still, but that's a development problem. As democracies develop and acquire political culture in the democratic sense, they will become transparent, and they will have an independent sense of values that doesn't include extortion and nepotism and bribery and undue influence, right? But what it looks like, at least if you take the United States as a model, what it looks like is that development takes you from this illegal market of third world corruption to an open, legalized market of first world corruption. Right? I mean, go and talk to lobbyists. Go and talk to super PAC operatives. Go and talk to campaign fundraisers. I mean, they're not especially shy. They're controlling the way politics works. They're sophisticated people. They know a lot. They don't consider themselves to be lawbreakers or doing anything wrong. Right? So this is the other way things could go. So instead of going from laissez-faire or from laissez-faire to regulation, we would go from regulation to laissez-faire. Right? This ideologically driven retrocession is another model. Now, in the United States, so this is the argument that, wow, this would be a strange direction for things to go internationally, right? And under the free and fair elections model, that would be strange. And another little anecdote about this, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption originally included draft Article 10, which brought political finance concerns, exactly the concerns I've been discussing, undue influence, conflicts of interest, brought them in under the rubric of corruption and required states parties to regulate in the interest of integrity. And that was in draft Article 10 of the United Nations Convention Against Corruption. Off the record, in going to the UN Office on Drugs and Crime in Vienna, I found out, big surprise, it was the US delegation that muscled people into tanking that article. And it's not in the treaty. Article 7 is, and the provisions on political finance are essentially non-existent and entirely voluntary. What is in there is entirely voluntary in this regard. So this isn't just an argument about US exceptionalism, that the US will be an island doing things in a weird way. It's an argument that the US model of plutocracy might be normative and might be influencing, whether sort of through back channel treaty type negotiations or the allocation of development funds and so on, might be influencing where the democratic form is going towards a legalized model of corruption. Now, that is incoherent not just in terms of where international law was going, but it's also incoherent in terms of where US democracy was going, right? And this again is where we have to put Trump into context. This was an evolution towards self-governance in a community of political equals. The US Revolution couldn't do everything, but it threw off monarchy, and there was a political community of white men with property who got to vote. And that was a much bigger community than the aristocracy. And wealth distribution was much closer together than it was back in England in the founding era in the United States. So revolution, that was a big step towards self-governance, even if there were slaves and women who couldn't vote, and Native Americans, Chinese, Jews, Catholics, Quaker. I mean, very few people could vote, okay? But American history changed that. It was a positive evolution towards political inclusion, right? Abolition of slavery, due process, African American suffrage, popular election of senators, female suffrage, you know the history, right? Bringing us all the way through to beyond the 60s to the 1970s with the enforcement of these last two pieces of landmark legislation, right? The accomplishment of Martin Luther King, the civil rights movement, and the millions of people who were with King. Some help from the Kennedys and so on. But anyway, we get up to here. These last pieces of legislation are enforced, and that's when the United States becomes a democracy, in the early 1970s. That's also Milton Friedman's time, and Eugene Fama. This is the time where the efficient market hypothesis was becoming a big idea. We don't need the government because markets have a wisdom that governments don't have. And they're also entirely free, and they, through price signals, determine the appropriate value of things. They incentivize creation of productive energy. Government just pushes people down and controls them. Well, those ideas became very popular. Does that mean that the US political evolution ended in the early 70s? No. When Congress enacted the Federal Election Campaign Act between 1971 and 1974 in different installments, they weren't following Milton Friedman, they were following actually John Rawls. So John Rawls in 1971 publishes, not political liberalism, but Theory of Justice. And the fair value of political liberties is in there in his 1971 Theory of Justice. And he says that the value of participatory rights, rights of political participation, is significantly diminished if those with economic power can control the system. And that you needed provisions that allowed people, regardless of socioeconomic status, to play a meaningful role in exercising political freedoms, obtaining representation in government, responsiveness, and being part of the political community. Political exclusion stops here, says Rawls. If we can't have it on the basis of race or sex or alienage, we shouldn't have it on the basis of wealth either, right? That's what Congress seemed to agree with. The state interests behind the Federal Election Campaign Act, not just combating corruption, Watergate happened here as well, so we do need to combat corruption, but they also had an equality interest attached and a access interest, passive suffrage really, running for office, that even if you weren't wealthy or didn't have wealthy friends and supporters, you still ought to be able to run. You should still, your viability as a candidate can't just depend on the money attached to your candidacy, can it? The Congress thought it shouldn't. So the US political evolution really is happening here, and it's even still happening in Buckley, because even though we get this free market metaphor for what the First Amendment means, the First Amendment, American democracy is an open marketplace, right? Milton Friedman is winning now, right? It's not the state that should govern, it's the market that should govern. But the Supreme Court attaches to the marketplace model of unlimited free speech, i.e. unlimited campaign expenditures, right? Because money is speech, according to the US Supreme Court. But they attach to that formulation a democratic purpose. We maintain this unfettered marketplace for expenditures and money in politics for the bringing about of the political and social changes desired by the people, said the Supreme Court in 1976. There's a long story here between 1976 and 2014 where this kind of bringing about the political and social changes desired by the people, i.e. responsiveness, representation, gets read out of the Constitution in campaign finance cases. The Roberts Court did most of the work. Buckley did some of the work, though. Besides equating money with speech, when Buckley evaluated expenditure limits, which was a big part of the Federal Election Campaign Act, Buckley said, well, we're only going to cite this part of the market metaphor now. They left off the civic purpose when they applied this formulation to expenditure limits. And so if the model for the First Amendment is the unfettered interchange of ideas, limiting money means limiting speech, they became very unsympathetic to the equality interest and very unsympathetic to the access for candidates without much money interest. But Buckley left this really important legacy, which was they assumed that how much money a candidate raised, because we had contribution limits that they validated, they assumed that how much money a candidate raised would be correlated with public support. Remember we were talking about that before? If only the donor-spender class, the money that they had, were correlated with public support, or at least they were representative in their ideas. And that's what Buckley assumed, but we know it's not true now. I don't think the court knew it wasn't true before, or at least they claim not to have known. So they posited that money in politics isn't such an undemocratic thing because the money is correlated with popular desire. If that were the case, then an open marketplace really would bring about democratic responsiveness. Okay? Now that's what the Roberts Court changed. The Rehnquist, this was the Berger Court with Buckley. The Rehnquist Court, after the Berger Court, had a whole case law, a whole line of jurisprudence really on undue influence. And undue influence was what happened when campaign spending and outside speech were not correlated with the public's desires. And that danger was especially heightened in the case of corporate expenditures. Because of the corporate form, corporations acquire so much more money, right, with all of their superpowers that they get, unlimited life and tax benefits and the ability to shape shift and reorganize and limited liability, all this stuff, right? So they amass a great deal of money, therefore in the economic sphere, therefore the money they have is really less correlated with public support, right? When you buy a product, you don't think I'm buying a Coors beer because I don't want people to have abortions. But that's what Coors money does, right? There are a bunch of corporations that have these political interests. Consumers don't think that way, most of us. Some people actually boycott Coors and other products associated with conservative or liberal causes, right, on that basis. So anyhow, the Rehnquist court says money in politics is dangerous because it's not correlated with popular support. Well, Chief Justice Roberts and Justice Alito, when they join the court and the court becomes the Roberts court, everything changes. The line in Citizens United that overrules this correlation type thinking, this undue influence type thinking, simply says that case interferes with the free market of ideas, period. And then the other thing that Citizens United says, this 2010 case, is that correlation doesn't matter. It is irrelevant, says the court, for First Amendment purposes, that the money that in general Treasury funds is or is not correlated with popular support for the corporation's political ideas. It simply doesn't matter anymore. And then the third piece that the court says in Citizens United and McCutcheon 2014 case is that democracy is premised on responsiveness. Sounds a lot like this, but that's not what they mean. What they say before that is access and influence are not corruption. Political access and political influence on the basis of large donations and large expenditures are not corruption. They are the reason for giving money to campaigns, and democracy is premised on responsiveness. In other words, if office holders and the speech environment responds to these financial signals, that's what democracy is about. And I'm not making this stuff up, I'm just rushing because I want to get to Trump before we have to go. So take a look at, if this is unfamiliar, take a look at Citizens United v. FEC, take a look at McCutcheon v. FEC, and you'll see these three ideas. Correlation doesn't matter, corruption does not include undue influence and undue access, and democracy is premised on responsiveness. To who? Well, the cases are about general Treasury expenditures and donors who want to give millions of dollars to campaigns. So that's who it's premised, who it's responsive to. Okay, so that's a bit about the ideological component of this interest group plutocracy model. That is the way the world is in the United States before we get to Trump. So that's where we were. What happens next? By the way, Buckley v. Valeo also strikes down limits on candidate expenditures. Trump would not have won, I'm fairly certain, and you can't know for sure, but I'm fairly certain Trump would not have won had he been able to spend only $50,000 of his own money. Or adjusted for inflation, I don't know what that would be now. Let's even say $2 million. That would not have been enough. Trump's primary campaign was lagging, and he had to give it millions of dollars. His general election campaign also lagged at certain points. Donors were not happy with Trump. He ended up spending $66 million of his own money to be elected by the Electoral College, not the general public. Anyhow, if this rule had stood, I think he would have lost. But Buckley struck it down for reasons I've already explained. Okay, so, sorry about the slides here. Okay. So we're going to come back to this plutocracy piece, and what does that have to do with kleptocracy in a minute. Let's come back to the idea of Trump and this unusual candidate who was fairly racist, or at least xenophobic, pretty nationalistic, talked about grabbing women in their genitals, blamed Muslims and immigrants for the world's problems in Mexico. How does a guy like that get elected? How does a guy like that get elected? Well, one thing is Hillary Clinton had a terrible campaign. Trust was a major, major issue for her. 70% of voters said they didn't trust her. And I mean, Democrats and Republicans put together said they didn't trust her. Part of that was the FBI and that ill-timed investigation, at least the second part first part was understandable, but her use of a private email server, which wasn't fully safe for confidential information, by the way. Lots of other Secretary of States have done the same thing. But anyhow, the FBI investigation came up again in the final week before the general election. That was a 1-2 punch that made Clinton seem pretty untrustworthy. And I think she is, by the way, but no more so than most candidates in recent history. She's a career politician, okay? She spins things, but it looked really bad and the FBI did not help. The Clinton Foundation ties did not help. It seemed like she was getting money from there or influence from there, or her husband was currying favor with major donors and so on. It didn't look good. The Russian hackers who come in, besides potentially throwing the election to Trump, they release embarrassing information about the Democratic National Committee and so on. There are all these random factors, the false news and trolling, the harassment of people. Some guy went with a gun, I forget where, to some establishment in Washington, D.C. because there was some rumor that Clinton was involved with, what was it, prostitution or arms peddling or child pornography or sexual slave. All this stuff was floating around the ether that Clinton was doing incredibly ridiculous and immoral things, right? And it was false news. So this is part of the destruction of trust. Another one that I think helps explain why Trump won at least the Electoral College was the Supreme Court case Shelby County v. Holder, which eliminated a federal oversight from the Voting Rights Act, this federal oversight over states that had been problematic in their construction and practice with voting rights. And once federal oversight was struck down, there was a host of changes to voting rights in 22 states. And that made a difference because Trump had incredibly low margins of victory. So we're talking about decreasing the hours of polling stations, closing polling stations in minority neighborhoods, more demanding forms of voter ID, a bunch of changes that seem neutral in theory, but in practice they exclude African Americans and the poor and Hispanics and so on. Early voting, eliminating early voting, just making it much harder for working class people without good transportation to cast their vote. Now, would that matter that much? Not in a landslide, it wouldn't, but look at his margins of victory in key states. 0.3%, 1%, 1.2%, between 0.3 and 3.8. These are narrow victories. And it's entirely plausible that beyond being able to spend $66 million of his own money, which could on its own explain the election, or besides the Russian hacking and the FBI, which on their own could explain the election results, there's also this, which on its own could explain the election results. Okay, it's not, there are many different factors that could give us this supposedly shocking victory. It wasn't shocking at all. Let's see. So the Electoral College, of course, is also an independent explanation that on its own explains the Trump victory. You see it in some parliamentary systems as well, right? With first past the post. There's many systems in which the person who gets the most votes doesn't always win. Well, it's also true in the Electoral College system where most states give all of their electoral votes to whoever gets a bare majority. So Clinton actually won more votes, but she won the wrong or fewer states. And she ends up losing the Electoral College by a fairly big margin, but that's misleading for reasons we've discussed. So that system, that antiquated system in the United States also is an independent explanation. But still, Trump got a lot of votes. Right? So we have to explain those before we get to kleptocracy because it's relevant. I'm not doing this just because I think it's interesting, but it's actually relevant to kleptocracy, who voted for Trump and why. So the religious vote, he killed Clinton with the evangelicals and the born-again crowd. Well, so does every Republican candidate. Ironic, though, because this guy's on his third wife. He isn't especially religious, and he does a bunch of immoral things commonly. But he still gets this vote, and this is sort of a, oh, you're the Republican, we'll vote for you kind of model. I'm calling this the racist vote because when you polled voters about the recent forest fire of police brutality towards African Americans, the motorists and so on, you've all heard of this, right? In the United States, there's been an incredible amount of police brutality, shooting black men who are fleeing, choking young black children to death. It's been incredible in the United States lately, the amount of police violence towards African Americans. But if you polled people who had voted and asked them, do you think African Americans are treated fairly? 80% of those who think African Americans are treated fairly voted for Trump. Certainly the uneducated vote, whites without a college degree, were fairly seriously in favor of Trump. The rural vote, also common for Republicans. They get the rural vote every time. But here's where it starts to get interesting. I'm calling it the unfortunate white vote, the downtrodden. The downtrodden voted for the Republican. And not just the Republican, but the conspicuous icon of capitalism. Right? Why would people who say that life is getting worse for Americans, people who said that they're doing worse now than they were last year, these are people who get hit with things like, I don't know, the subprime mortgage crisis, sort of excesses of greed in society. This is what tends to hit these people. 83% of voters who said the most important thing was bringing needed change, whatever that means to them, voted for Trump. Why? If your problems are economic in a hyper-capitalist system that's failing most of the people in the United States, why would you vote for this conspicuous icon of wealth? It's counterintuitive. Unless, you might be thinking, well, that's the way the world works today, so let's pick the guy who knows how to win in that kind of model. That's logical, right? But what's not so logical is to think that this kind of person would still uphold your interests and the interests of the country instead of his own. He's made a career out of tanking organizations, bankruptcy, this sort of stuff, right? You really think he's going to be a good steward? But this is the Trump cohort. Clinton, on the other hand, won the minority vote, as all Democrats do. She won the educated vote, as most of the time the Democrats do. She won the vote of people interested in experience and judgment. A lot of people who voted for Trump don't trust him or don't think that he's qualified, but they voted for him because of needed change. Now, Clinton gets the optimistic, fortunate vote. People who say they're doing better now than they were last year, people who believe they'll have similar or better lives in the future are going for Clinton and not for Trump. Again, Trump is the choice of people who are not doing well. So this is my question. Why would they vote for a billionaire or businessman? I did cover one logical explanation. This is the way the world works. We need a guy who knows how to win in this casino society. That's the guy who we need running the country. Okay, it's a logical thought, but I think it's deeper than that. Trump says, I've been greedy, greedy, greedy. What I've done is grabbed all the money I can. Now I'm going to do that for the United States. Applause. That wouldn't always get applause, would it? Would you applaud that line? Any of you? Seriously? It's satire. Won him the presidency of the United States. Okay, here's one of the things that I've come across that I think is very highly connected to why Trump would win, and it's subconscious. He seemed like a law professor who was interested in data, and then he started talking about subconscious stuff and psychics, and he lit incense, and we all laughed him out of the room, right? Bear with me for a second. Psychologists now are doing a lot of work with the subconscious. And they're doing a lot of work with what's called system justification theory. And this is big at major universities across the world. This is a big line of research now. And the finding is counterintuitive, that when human beings are immersed in social systems, they have deep psychological needs to justify those systems, even if the systems harm them. Whatever it is. The family you're in, it's brutal, but hey, he's my dad. the economic system you're in, I keep getting fired and so on. Consciously, you're mad as hell. Subconsciously, your psychological needs are crying out for that system to be legitimized. I'll tell you why in a second. So, motivations for system justification. Psychologists isolate an epistemic need, which is we need to be able to explain the world. And if we're undermining the core systems, the economic system, the political system, the world feels chaotic and unsafe. Even if it oppresses me, at least I know this system. At least we're all rooted in something. At least it's not anarchy. Existential, related to that, the need for order and control. Relational, if you can't achieve a shared reality with others, it's deeply disturbing to the human psyche, according to this research. Again, we might not like predatory capitalism or some of Trump's cronies and so on, but we know that's the way the world works, and we can bond with other people over a beer about that. And feeling good about one's society, there's an inherent human need to feel good about it, even if it isn't ideal. Okay, now, here's where it starts to get really spooky. I said that system justification has located a human need to justify a system even when it doesn't benefit the individual. What if your powerlessness is increasing? What if we're living in Piketty's world where economic inequality is increasing? Okay, we're not talking about a system that's unjust, that's staying the same. We're talking about a system that is unjust in terms of distributive outcomes, and it's getting worse. Okay, that's Piketty's world, that's Gilens and Page's world, where democracy is entirely unresponsive. How does that affect system justification? You would think system justification becomes weaker as these systems start to tank, as they start to work to the detriment of most people. You would think system justification would start to disappear. The opposite is true. The greater the degree of powerlessness within a system, the greater the need to justify a system. That's the 2014 finding from psychologists at some of the leading universities in the United States. So you can plug this into the plutocracy model, can you not? When you poll Americans on money in politics and corruption, an increasing majority of Americans is absolutely furious about corruption and money in politics. There's wide bipartisan agreement that the United States is systemically corrupt and that politicians do not listen to the people who are polled. They listen instead to you know who. Rather than, so that's our conscious conviction. Our subconscious response is to vote for the billionaire businessman, who, by the way, is richer than all other US presidents combined. We've had a lot of millionaire presidents. Put them all together, Trump still has more money than they did in real money today, adjusted for inflation. Okay. If anyone wants the citations to that really counterintuitive line of psychological research, I have them for you. Okay. Now, great. System justification is not our only psychological need. We also need to feel good about ourselves, and we need to feel good about our group. Again, this is a precursor. This is why Trump wins. So we have this need for ego justification, that I'm a good and worthy person who makes an effort and isn't stupid. I'm smart and I'm a valid member of society. And people of my race and my profession and my church group and my family are also smart and valid members of society. How do you rectify that with justifying the system that puts you down? Let's face it, you're losing out in capitalism, and you're losing out in interest group plutocracy. And you have a need to justify those things without feeling bad about yourself or your group. How do you thread that needle if you're a candidate? It's called populism. The world is on fire, and my place in society is lower and lower every day. Not because I'm unworthy or stupid or don't make an effort, but because of these people. Right? The problem is not capitalism in its crony capitalist form. The problem is not democracy in its plutocratic form. The problem is Muslims bringing Sharia law to America, and these Mexicans coming over the border, and these Syrian refugees. And yeah, the Ku Klux Klan gets involved too. And we can salvage our own ego and group justification needs despite everything the world has learned about us. We're saving the country, the Ku Klux Klan, and Trump is our candidate. Diversity is white genocide, say Trump supporters. All right, you get the idea. Also, Trump doesn't just go, of course, after immigrants and African, well, he doesn't go after African Americans directly, but you remember his response to the civil rights issues that were going on in the United States, when civil rights demonstrators were killed by alt-right, white nationalist type people. Trump's response was like, we can't really allocate blame. The civil rights protesters also have their radical people there, right? So I mean, his response to African Americans is also a good way of validating the egos and group justification needs of whites who voted for him. But he also blames corporations, and he doesn't want them shipping their jobs abroad. So this is the genius of populism right here. So you all get the argument, right? You can sort of satisfy your ego and group justification needs, justify the system, vote for a billionaire populist. It's not that surprising if you read the psychological research. Okay. So that's what gets, in my opinion, that's what gets Trump elected. That huge long list of factors, from the Electoral College and unlimited personal spending, voting rights restrictions, psychological, subconscious factors affecting voters, a liberal populism threading the needle. All these things happen. They lead us now to a place where we can go from plutocracy to a more efficient and profitable version. So plutocracy depended on these interest groups. You can read Theda Skocpol and Alexander Fernandez's recent paper, 2016, on the Koch network. Talks about how sophisticated plutocracy has become. But it's this horizontal network that is really complicated. It's exerting pressure on leadership. It's complicated. That doesn't sound very efficient, right? If you wanted to run the country, why not just do it directly? Right? That's the idea behind kleptocracy. It's more efficient, more profitable, cut out the middlemen. So you get Trump himself, his sort of Gilded Age cabinet of very wealthy people with direct financial interests in the agencies that they're heading. The education, commerce, EPA, these agencies are all now headed by individuals with direct personal interests in the policies. It's not just that policy changes will benefit constituents down there in the weeds of the horizontal network. It's that the new head of the EPA and the new head of education, the new head of commerce will make a lot of money themselves. Trump himself will make a lot of money from his tax plan. Okay, that's kleptocracy. Government by those who seek personal gain at the expense of the governed. How are we doing on time? I need to wrap this up very soon. Let's see. Okay, I'll just give you a list of factors that I'm working on, and we'll stop there. Let's see. So I've covered most of them. Nepotism is a big one. If you look at the role of Jared Kushner, Ivanka Trump, Trump's own sons, common to other kleptocracies. Chase is a researcher in this field who I recommend. She's been all over the world, and she talks about common elements among kleptocracies. If you need to keep things secret, well, blood ties are nice for that. If you have to avoid reporting and records of conversations, well, who better than family members who are sleeping in the same house? Right? Cannibalizing state agencies is standard when you can't co-opt them. Trump is doing both. He's co-opted the EPA and he's defunding it, the Environmental Protection Agency. There's a lot of money still to be made in natural resources if we can just get rid of the regulations. So you get the idea now, conflicts of interest across the board. Trump has businesses all over the world, as you all know, and it's very hard to monitor. The ripple effects of all policy that he and his cabinet are involved in are massive for his business holdings. So this is a bit of the kleptocracy model. My big question, which I'll leave you with, is will kleptocracy be legalized the same way plutocracy has? The Supreme Court's case law from 1976 to 2014 legalizes plutocracy. It's not just de facto, which would be corrupt. Yeah, you know, this is the way things work, but we're not proud of it. No. Now it's de facto and de jure. It's according to law and pursuant to constitutional interpretation that the wealthy gain much more responsiveness and representation than the rest of us, according to Supreme Court case law. Will something similar happen to kleptocracy? So the big pieces in play: conflict of interest law that's been interpreted by the federal government over time. How would the Supreme Court interpret the conflicts of interest statute? We don't know yet. So far, it's been interpreted to say that it doesn't apply to the president and vice president. Or the emoluments clause, which is about prohibiting, in the Constitution, prohibiting receipt of benefits from foreign powers. That the president can't accept emoluments, right? Gifts, benefits, and so on. Does that include foreign dignitaries who stay in his hotel in DC? Is that an emolument? Does it include the patent China gave him? Does it include the loans that Deutsche Bank has given him? Or when he renegotiates those loans, whatever terms he gets, is that an emolument? Right now, every Democratic member of Congress is suing Trump over the emoluments clause. And there's also suits ongoing with conflicts of interest. I will be interested to see whether kleptocracy becomes a lawful form of government as opposed to the United States' own particular third world banana republic. Thanks for your time. I'd love to have questions in the discussion.
Thanks very much.